Hi, I'm David Miller, here with what I'm sure you will be relieved to hear is the last in a series of 7 mini-lectures on Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Today we're going to talk about the badge of bitterness. Last time we ended with the messenger declaring himself unable to report truly how much Claudio has bettered himself. Let's look now at the rest of our passage in lines 15 to 24. With the mention of Claudio's uncle, the opening lines take us from a dynamic of expectation and report to one of modesty and display. The uncle is so overjoyed by Claudio's performance of military valor that he bursts into tears. Both Claudio's dynamic of excess and his uncle's dynamic of restraint belong to the system of shame and honor, but they express contrasting aspects of this system. Claudio's performance seeks honor, while his uncle's conspicuous display of modesty avoids shame. Both of these dynamics are pushed to the extreme in the language of this passage, where performance exceeds expectation so excessively that report lags behind. Modest display converts this excess back into restraint so as not to violate decorum. The dynamic of performance gloriously surpasses limits, even as it idealizes a correspondence between merit and reward. The dynamic of modest display cultivates limits, even as it reverses the correspondence between emotions and their badges, expressing joy through tears instead of dancing in the end zone. In describing how Claudio's uncle responds to the news, the messenger begins by resuming the pattern established earlier. His much joy, echoing the honor Claudio much deserved, doubles and exceeds itself, just as the lamb-faced lion has done, much becoming even so much, and then returning again in great measure. On the way from much to great measure, something happens to the uncle's joy. Its action is not doing, like Claudio's. Instead, the joy first appears and then shows itself, its action not one of deeds, but of self-display. The standard appropriate to self-display is not excess, but decorum or propriety. The uncle's excessive joy would appear immodest if he woofed and pumped his fist, so it disguises itself as its own opposite by wearing a badge of bitterness. To exceed itself, while still remaining socially acceptable, it masks as its own opposite. For another example of this decorum, compare Balthasar's dispraise of his own singing voice in Act 2, Scene 3, at lines 39 to 52. More ado about noting. The dynamic of modesty and display that we encounter in this language appears throughout Much Ado, where actions of display are repeatedly associated with transgression, disguising, and shame. For example, Margaret appears in the window of Hero's bedchamber as if Hero were showing herself to be the opposite of what she really is, chaste. And Claudio punishes Hero with public shaming. Her reputation destroyed by slander, she must wear death as the ultimate badge of bitterness in order to show herself modest enough to be married. Beatrice characteristically speaks in an aggressive way that tests the boundaries of the feminine. That's why her uncle warns her, "Thou wilt never get thee a husband if thou be so shrewd of thy tongue." Her verbal displays of wit are transgressive in their way, and Beatrice too is shamed for this, as Greenblatt points out in his introduction, though it turns out that her punishment is not the spinsterhood Leonatus warns against, but the marriage she pretends to shun. Note by way of contrast that even though Benedict loves outrageous speeches as much as Beatrice does, he is not seen as transgressing against gender roles, only as risking the boundaries of politeness and good sense. And though he too is shamed, the shaming is not as threatening to him. Conceding, "I may chance to have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken upon me," he nevertheless decides that quips and sentences and paper bullets of the brain will not awe him from the career of his humor. And he ends the play declaring, "A college of wit-crackers shall not flout me out of my humor." If we assume that Beatrice and Benedict really want each other all along, an assumption interpretations of the play have traditionally accepted, although Greenblatt questions it, then in pursuing their merry war, they too are hiding their affections under a badge of bitterness. Now, back in the passage we've been examining, Leonardo responds to the messenger's figure of speech by asking, "Did he break out into tears?" It's almost as if the message itself were wearing a disguise, in this case the messenger's ornate figure of speech, and Leonardo needed to peek behind the mask to be sure he correctly understands. The messenger's reply, in great measure, not only confirms Leonardo's guess, it also turns restraint back into excess. If joy shows itself modest by appearing as tears, the tears are nevertheless excessive. As the badge of restraint turns into an overflow of tenderness, we seem to be back in a pattern of going beyond. Leonardo rescues us from this potentially infinite regress of paradoxes and reversals in which things keep surpassing themselves and turning into their opposites. Renaming the badge of bitterness as a kind overflow of kindness, he uses repetition not to emphasize contrast or disproportion, but to assert a reassuring correspondence between the naturalness or appropriateness of the emotion and the sincerity or integrity of the person who displays it. Joy may have to be disguised as its own opposite, but there are no faces truer than those washed with its tears. And so the passage comes to rest on a complacent note of sentimental morality. How much better it is to weep at joy than to joy at weeping. The next line belongs to Beatrice, who gallops the conversation off in another direction. At the same time as the exchange between Leonatus and the messenger comes to rest in this banality, it is also anticipating the main action of the plot more explicitly, and more ironically, than at any point in the passage. It is, of course, Don John, the bastard, who will joy at weeping, and who will put on a false face to deceive his brother and Claudio, despite claiming to be a plain-dealing villain whose motto is, "I cannot hide what I am." The true faces that weep at joy anticipate this deception by way of contrast, much as they anticipate the false faces of the masquerade ball and all the other false faces those masks symbolize. The mistaken impression that Don Pedro was hero for himself, the pretended hostility with which Beatrice and Benedict tease one another, the trick Don Pedro orchestrates to deceive them, and Margaret's unwitting impersonation of Hero. Like the play it mirrors, then, the passage we have been examining comes to rest in an apparently happy ending that pairs true faces with the true feelings they express. But this seemingly happy ending foreshadows a great deal of error, falsehood, and conflict. Should we assume the same thing about the seemingly happy ending to the play? Well, remember what Lord Byron said about tragedy and comedy as they end in death or marriage. The future states of both are left to faith. There's one question I always get in response to this kind of extremely close stylistic analysis. Do you think Shakespeare was really conscious of doing all that? When it comes, I give the only possible answer. I don't know. All I know is he did it. The point of the analysis is not to claim that Shakespeare consciously thought about every nuance we have discovered in the play's language, nor is it to show what readers and audiences ought to consciously think about. The student who asks if Shakespeare thought about these things is probably not thinking, while asking the question, that he uses Shakespeare's name as the subject of the verb thought, nor that he employs a particular word order and pattern of inflection to signal that the utterance is cast in the interrogative mood. Nevertheless, on a practical level, the questioner does grasp these things, or he wouldn't be able to ask the question, and I wouldn't be able to understand it. We're so accustomed to the language we use that we don't have to think about how it does what it does. Since we're not at all accustomed to the language Shakespeare uses, it helps to slow things down, like instant replay, to see what really happens. The first point of this analysis, then, is to show you how much there is in Shakespeare's language if you know how to look for it. The second point, and this holds true for your critical writing too, is that the exercise of analyzing this language a few times for practice should have a long-term effect on the way you read. By that I don't mean that from now on you'll read just like this, but what we loosely call reading includes many different mental skills and activities, and the verbal analysis you do in a literature class is meant to expand the range of what you're aware of and what you're capable of. The idea, in other words, is to add a few arrows to your readerly quiver. Shakespeare, after all, spent his school days doing double translation exercises, in which the student would start with a passage from a Latin author, maybe Virgil or Cicero, translate the passage into English, put it away, and then later retranslate it back to Latin, comparing the twice-translated result with its untranslated original to see how and where he had strayed from his model in this or that detail. Just imagine how finely that kind of labor could hone a gifted student's sense of style. That's why I say Shakespeare wouldn't need to think through each separate nuance of the lines he composed, so long as he had a sharp sense of how style works. It would be enough that the combination of long practice and spectacular talent had given him a feel for what he wanted the words to do. For us, too, it will be enough if working closely with those words sharpens our sense of how they work and what they do. A play by Shakespeare is not a static, closed form like an object that stands before us. It is a verbal process based on dynamic, open-ended patterns that work to generate meaning when we use them to think with, when we bring them alive through the act of paying attention. This process cannot take place without us. Our act of attention is supremely important, and its results are shaped as much by our knowledge, skills, and interests as they are by the words on the page. It's almost as if, in reading Shakespeare, we become his collaborators. Being dead, he is very cooperative. The book waits patiently for us to open it and bring the astonishing words to life in our minds once again, and while it offers us endless possibilities, it never tells us just what to think or feel about the illusions that rise from its pages.